Why, as always, we feel like we're laughing when this thing goes live.
Well, we are happy people, so we need to keep it happy. So, good day, everyone. I'm gonna get
Hi,
it right
everybody.
this time. Yep, it's not morning, afternoon, or evening. So wherever you are, good day to you all. Thank you again for joining us in this conversation. And today we have a very special guest, and I'll let Sean to introduce him. But before that, please join us in our LinkedIn Cyber Risk Governance community so we can continue to share our insights with you and scan the QR code if you see it on the bottom. So with that as an introduction from me, so I'm going to pass it on to Sean.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Today, we are joined by Frank Wood. And Frank is a certified as a project manager, business continuity planner, and a protection professional. His experience as a security executive ranged from a period of time with a three-letter government agency to a period with a small firm we've all heard of, General Electric, where he served as security officer for GE Digital. Uh, there, he led risk management efforts in the area of business continuity and crisis management. He's also founded the advisory firm Hawkeye Resilience Advisors, where he collaborates with organizations to create strategies to prevent and recover from disruptions. Frank, thank you very much for joining us today.
No, thank you, Sean. Appreciate the time. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. So, we met not too long ago when you joined our, as Stanley mentioned, our cyber risk governance community on LinkedIn. And during that conversation, you were talking with Stanley and you asked to understand a little bit more about our approach with our security risk assessment that we call SARA. And just for those that don't really know, SARA is a security risk assessment offered as a baseline, a professional development, and then an integrated platform as a service. And it's essentially a baseline penetration test and configuration assessment to align you with compliance or cybersecurity frameworks. So, in the conversation, Frank, you saw some connection to the way we address cyber risk into what you're helping organizations with. And what was that?
Yeah, great question. A lot of people do security assessments in a variety of fashion. The one thing that caught my eye was the visualization of the
Mm,
reports. A lot of times, companies will produce 18, 25 pages of narrative. Take that and give it to not a CISO, but to a CFO who's trying to understand what the vulnerabilities are and what is the budgeting that's going to be required to look at that. Give it to a HR executive to see if there's potential challenges in terms of staffing. It doesn't make sense. And when I
right.
work with some of my customers and clients, you know, those are the decision makers. Unfortunately, I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar can, nod their head to this, and that sometimes they're not the decision maker, and maybe in the authority to
And
do
which
the
they
project,
were.
but not necessarily the budgeting or the headcount or other things. So is the visual straightforwardness, the easy to comprehend, that
Mm,
really got me thinking more and more about how I'm working with my clients and educating them on some of their cyber risks and other risks that are impacting the organizations, because you need to be able to tell a story, and you need to be able to tell a story quickly. And that was one of the things that why I really wanted to understand and learn more, because it is such a white space environment and everyone has something different to provide.
What do
And
you
also
mean by
you have,
white? Go ahead,
yeah,
Stanley.
and also one of the thing tied into the white space, that one of the comment that you shared that back with me is, you know, sometimes that it being assuming that person understand the technical side when you have generated a report like what you just talked about, but that person might be wearing multiple hats at the same time. And so how are you going to bring a, let's call it a generic report, whatever, based on the technology solution it spits out from, and able to address multiple hats that they are wearing when you're submitting the report, but you don't know what hat they are wearing on that day.
Yeah, I would look at it this way too. you want to be able to address the different channels, different leadership silos that make up any organization, be it a small nonprofit to a large international conglomerate. People will be dual-hatted, either by delegation or just what they're responsible for. But when we're talking about risk and risk assessments, what we don't want to do is generalize them. We want to make them detailed enough so that the practitioners can understand what's happening. But then we also don't want to have a filter so that executive leadership or board level communications gloss over some of the high level nuances that are the actual risks themselves. And so by using certain tools, you can use the same system and tell a story over time, but then also double click into a certain few areas so that you can have a good, intelligent conversation without having to do copy paste into 14 different systems in order to enable that conversation time and time again.
And go back to that question of white space. Is that what you're referring as white space?
Yeah, absolutely.
Elaborate.
My comment around white space is, there's no, let me rephrase that. There's very little requirements around risk assessment, what goes into it, and what the output has to look like. There are some good industry standards, general practices, but there's a lot of white space in terms of how you want your page to look. And so that was my comment rationale behind that.
And that ties it back into our original principle, why we defined as Sarah to go into the data analytics side, is because we try to break it down into all these, what we refer as silos, right? A pen test report is a silo for the financial people. It's because it doesn't correlate, right? It's like, what does it really do? Right. And then go into further, of course, based on the dual hat or the single hat that they're wearing, that report means different contexts in different contexts to them. So from a business executive point of view, from a business owner perspective, when I receive it, all those report or spreadsheets, what am I looking at? I don't know what that really means. And that is being, that has been asked, for the many years, unfortunately, to a lot of business executives asking me, well, I'm looking at this report, but where do I start? Goes back into, and it hasn't changed all these years. Where do I start? Where do I go? Where is it going to end? Those are the three questions that they ask all the time. Can you help us to explain that a little bit and break it down a little bit and define it, why data analytic, what we agree, or data visualization is important to our audience?
Yeah, sure. So let me take it in the stages that you just outlined, and where does it start? I think one of the biggest breakdowns that many organizations have is just that. Where do I start? Because it seems so large and so nebulous. My number one suggestion to anyone that I'm talking with is start somewhere. It doesn't matter what you're doing, but start today. You've heard me use this, and I'll share it with our audience, and I'm sure it's, again, a euphemism that's not used by anybody else. But security is like air. It's not important until you're not getting any. The other way that it's said is, when is the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. The next best time is today. Right? So you have to start, and you have to understand your risks first. So do your risk assessment and start to understand those. But then, during this whole process, as we're looking at risk and pen testing and the new vulnerabilities that come out every single, dare I say, hour these days, is to keep an inventory and keep that risk register live. It's not a static document. A lot of people are using these tools and techniques as a snapshot in time, and it really can't be. And that's why when we go and look at, where does it end? It doesn't. Unfortunately, that's the world that we're living in today. It doesn't stop. It won't stop because there's new vulnerabilities, new aggressive actors that are in networks and looking for information that you may have or information they think you have that might be vulnerable. And so being able to defend, to delay, to detect, but then all of it comes to, well, what do you do when something happens? Right. And that's why I say it doesn't end, because if there is an individual, an organization, a nation state that is interested in your data, they're going to throw everything at it and they're going to do everything they can. So what do you do when that intrusion occurs, when something is lost? You have to have it pre-planned, and you have to
But
have
Frank,
thought ahead of time.
nobody has all the unlimited budget in the world, right? We need to,
Right.
from a business owner perspective, it has to have some type of end. And of course, from our perspective, why we're talking about cyber risk governance is, where we think that it can be part of this journey or measurement to put some type of stop, or at least some stop gaps around it, is to put these type of milestones around it, right? Based on the governance objective, the company's governance objective, and how can it be tied into, the compliance requirements for mid-sized business or small size businesses. Enterprise is another thing, but focus back onto the SMB environment, according to World Economic Forum, as defined by 250 million below, below the revenue size is SMB, because that has always been a question to me as well. What is an SMB? So around the world is different already, right? So we
Right.
understand the dynamic, and also tied it back into one of the, Sean always we use this as governance is like a noun. It doesn't move a lot. So it's good for, for milestone checking, for measurements.
Right.
But the cybersecurity is a verb. It changes all the time based on the context and what you just alluded to about, the dynamics of all these technology solutions, types of hacks, and environment changes because of the, rules and regulations and compliance also change. So we advise, we suggest our audience to look at measuring from their own, industrial or global or local requirements, regulatory and compliance requirements, as a milestone to check on it. What is being defined from the technical side. So we try to move the needle between the two ends of the spectrum into one. What would you recommend from that perspective? Do you think it's a good idea to start with, or what other suggestion would you have, recommend to our audience? How do they put some type of stop, to make sure that they're operational, effective, and cost efficient at the same time?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right in that there does need to be an end point somewhere. And I think it comes down to two different things, in addition to what you just said, or maybe rephrased in a different manner. The first is having a deep conversation with the organization's leadership of what is their risk tolerance. And again, that's not a snapshot conversation, because organizations change. They might be very aggressive one year, or when we see there's a recession or something happening, they might become very more conservative. And so having that dialogue and continual conversation of what's the risk tolerance of the organization? Are they willing to have some gaps? And that's where the second point comes in, is what is the businesses or the enterprise's acceptable loss? And I think that's a very foreign concept to have in some conversations, certainly when we're talking about security, because loss is a negative, period, done, that's a noun, right? But I'll challenge to say that not all loss has to be mitigated, or it needs to be an eyes wide open conversation for the organization to own up to. A great example of that is, trying to add a program, technology process that's going to cost $100,000 to protect a $10,000 asset. Now, the CFO will, won't even raise their hand at that point, right? That's a table slapper and walk away. But that $10,000, that asset might mean something to the company, to its ownership, to its stakeholders, that it's more than just a, asset on a balance sheet. It's something that's, brand awareness. And so that's the risk tolerance. What are we willing to leave through the back door? Do we want to lock up the operation for a pack of 3M notes? That's for the company to decide. So those are the conversations that need to have to answer your question, Stanley, to really address where do we stop and how do we measure its effectiveness? Because all of us are responsible for our budgets and our programs to say, are we meeting our objectives? And to the same point, and I will be the first one to say I never like to admit it, but are there areas where we have gold plating? Maybe we're over or we're exceeding our risk tolerance. And are there areas where we will be challenged in the future to say, do we need to have some more conversations with the leadership team?
As the topic of business continuity in regard to cyber and the planning for such an event, where would you has become more common today? Where would you suggest organizations start the internal conversations? Is it with a risk register? Is it with a business impact analysis? Do they start with an assessment from a third party?
Yeah, a great question, Sean. And organizations really have to start with that risk register. They have to understand what the risks and vulnerabilities are, because then from there, you can start to categorize on what are the critical processes for the business and work into a business impact analysis and understand what are those, prioritized areas.
Right.
And again, have the conversation so that everyone is on board as to what are the recovery steps from an ITDR or an operational resilience plan. Those really need to be integrated and discussed, because in a time of crisis, everyone's going to do something which they think is the best solution,
Priority.
or the good intended actions, which will
Right.
distract or potentially deprioritize the plan if it's not thought of ahead of time.
Right. So do you have a suggestion of how to start going about on that risk register? Is it a simple process? Or can it be a simple process to at least start before getting somebody like you involved?
It can be a simple process, Sean. It can be an Excel spreadsheet, and that's okay. It's really about recording what are your risks from your people, your process, your tools, your technology, your environment around you. And that could be cyber environment, could be your physical environment. But then as those items are collected and distilled, I will tell you that, a chat GPT is not going to be able to analyze that for your business.
Right.
Can come up with some great analytics. I love it, but it is still a human touch with regards to business and tolerance and emotions to say, how are we going to prioritize those items? And that's where I would invite others to bring someone into the conversation that can help them build that business impact analysis and walk through the steps and stages, so that when you come to the conclusion of it, you have a plan in your hands that literally either printed or in the palm of your hand with your phone or another device to say, when something goes wrong, we have a plan. And I'll be particular about my verbiage. When something goes wrong, it's not an if. Everyone on this call and watching this webinar afterwards has had an impact either in their personal life, their professional life, or a network one connection away that can say something will happen. And
Absolutely.
for people to be ignorant of it is, I use it in the sense of not being aware of it in terms of ignorance, is truly not wanting to see the risk and has,
Right.
decided not to address it up front and is hoping that the people that are on their team are smart enough and organized enough to address it. But unfortunately, hope is not a plan. And none of us on this call who are interested in the topic want to be responsible for these things happening and coming up with a plan when the crisis has already occurred.
Well, you,
Agreed.
you
I mean,
touch
the
on a couple
number.
of points. Sorry, go ahead, Sean.
I was going to say, you're right. You're right, Frank. It's never a if, it's a when, regardless of what type it is. And I speak for that as having been the leader of a distribution facility in the Midwest here. Uh, it was a matter of when we got hit with a ransomware attack. It was a matter of when we had the generator ripped off our roof that ran our server room. And I got a phone call from our IT support team at 4 o'clock in the morning saying, "Hey, the servers are crashing. We're bringing you down now." So it's always a matter of when. It's never an if with any of these things, whether it's an act of God or a cyber incident.
But despite all these very valuable informations that go back into the point of for a lot of business executive, from the statistics pointing out to maybe only 25% around that figure that really understand what is going on in the terms of cybersecurity. Now, at the same time, like you just said, it's just one person away that they know that there is cyber attack is going on every day. You and I talked about the information overload. And this is the part that ties it into Sean's, experience and, being their vendor at that point, we were the IT vendor for Sean, and calling him, and Sean to say, it's like, okay, and how much are you going to cost me now for this phone call? It's like, I'm sorry, Sean, but this is part of the things that I've been warning you, telling you what to do. But at the same time, it's like, okay, Sean come back to me and say, I don't know whether what you're telling me is true or not. How can I trust you? Because all you do is just come and ask me for money. Now, everybody, and you sat on that chair before too. All the vendors in the world, wants to get to know you because they want to sell you something. All the business owner out there, I'm still getting a lot of calls. It's like selling me stocks and selling me this and that, and all the time. So how can we, from again going back into the business executive, doesn't have to be the owner, but executive point of view. When you have to make a decision, how do you weed out all the noise and start with a more purposeful journey, and to start, the ultimate goal is continuously measuring and monitoring the cyber resilience maturity level for the organization. But wearing dual hats, multiple hats, share with your insights, because you deal with billion-dollar company before, so you got a lot of moving parts, lots of different level from your organizations. How do you tell the lowest denominator, how should they make the decisions?
Hmm.
I know this is a very deep conversation, but I'm sure that, because I've been asked all the time, and as a vendor, it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to tell you my way of doing it. But of course, a lot, they, like Sean back in those days, he take it with a grain of salt, rightfully so. But he has to start from somewhere, going back to the same question.
Yeah, so it is I'll say a deep question, but a loaded question at the same time. Because there's so many compare and contrast that needs to occur when you're looking at a vendor that's, you're bringing on board. You're bringing someone on board because you don't have the resources within your organization to do it effectively, or there is a niche, technology that's being offered or utilized that you wouldn't want to develop in-house. Or it's just an area where you are going to hand it off because it's something that the organization doesn't want to manage anymore. it comes down to the product solution, right? Does it actually solve the problem? How much effort is it going to take on our part, right? The organization's part to implement, the number of APIs, the number of, the building up of technical debt that I have to manage in order for this product to utilize. But I'll tell you, one of the biggest differentiators for me over time have been the vendors' willingness, but also their desire to be a partner and not a vendor.
Mm.
And I'll differentiate the two. I too have had a lot of people come to me, and even today, wanting to sell me something. Here's a widget, here's a program, here's a fill in the blank. Those that I speak with more or have the follow-up conversations are those that want to be part of the solution long term. They're not in it for here's the purchase order, we exchange goods, we exchange money, and hey, take care, thanks a lot, Stanley, maybe I'll hit you up in 5 years. It's the person that's going to be on the phone and calling me and picking it up at 4 a.m. It's the one that is, asking, well, wait a second, I understand you want to use my solution for this, but I don't hear that, or that's not the right applicability for it. What if we did it this way? And is again almost being like they're part of the solution, not just offering a solution. So it has to solve the problem. It has to be within the right, budget, which is always an important item. But it has to be looked at from an initial cost as well as from a operational cost. And taking all of that into account is how I've been able to find some really great partners and vendors, over the years.
And to be honest with you, it's not really a loaded question, because I saw how you share your company information, and you break it down into 3 parts: our story, our value, our mission. And which is what I like about why I asked this question, is because you and I had this conversation a couple of times, not very, not a lot, but what is the value coming from? First, we got to know how to paint that picture, not just a short-term picture, but a long-term picture. And based on the short-term and long-term picture, what is the value that we're offering? And what is it in for both of us? Not just because you're paying me money, then I have to take it and just swallow that, out my pride and principle, just to follow it. No, and I said it many times. I have terminate contract because the CEO of some of the executive, it just have unreasonable expectations. When they engage with us, the CEO doesn't want to change the battery of the mouse. Oh, go call IT to take care of that. And I want to get it done in an hour. It's like, you know what? Yeah, your money is great, but do I really want to do that under that constant pressure and being unreasonable, have unreasonable expectations? I know, that's why I'm poor, because, I have this stupid principle of mine. So it's not really a loaded question. It basically is just in yes, I understand that different business run different way. They have their own business principles, but at the same time, I go back into your storyline, your value. Okay, where does it make sense? Where is the line in the sand that we have to draw to provide that value, to make sure that it becomes, like what you said, a mutual partnership, not just a one-way direction.
No,
Anyway,
that's
so that's
exactly it.
just my thought.
No, you're spot on, and but let's tie it all together, right? And let's look at the cyber just risk resilience programs that are out there. Many companies have reduced their footprint for some of these programs. Cyber is one of the most important topics today in government, military, private, nonprofits. It's here and it's going to stay. But then The challenge continues with, okay, so we've put up some shields, we've put up some gates, we've put up some areas of detection. Do we really need to spend that $50,000 a year, Stanley? Can we just get rid of that? You know, because we got some other things going on. How do you demonstrate that? How do you show the value of some of these programs to, again, those that aren't touching the keyboard or looking at the metrics and the reports and the vulnerabilities and the risk registers? How do you share that story to say that $50,000 has prevented certain actions from happening? We'd all love to work ourselves out of a job. That means that there are no bad actors out there trying to come in and take care of, our own information.
Hey, AI would do that. That's what they will get us out of the job. And that's why actually, this is the conversation that you bring in is the value. Okay, so we all been playing with AI, right? And then now there's the differentiator between different AI. Now it become a generative AI and all that. And go back into the battery. It's like, okay, the CEO doesn't want to change the battery because his time is valuable or her time is valuable. Okay, understandable. But going back into, well, maybe it's a solution, maybe it's a suggestion, so it's continuous measuring and monitoring and set the right objective, setting up the right expectations. You know, try to answer my own questions back to, where do I start? That's why we thought long and hard to go back into what we offer starting like 15 years ago as a penetration test, because it's now, one vendor had talked about, vulnerability vulnerable doesn't mean it's not exploitable.
Hmm.
So you address the vulnerabilities, but at the same time that what is being exploited, that knowing the unknown in our language, in our 3 steps process, is knowing the unknown and able to identify, hey, I need somebody to take care of my mouse battery or all the batteries in my IT system. Okay, fine, at least that is being defined as general as that, right? And there's nothing wrong with it as long as the mutual party understand, well, that is my responsibility, and I'm going to put my value, whatever the value that equals to the CEO thinks changing battery is too hectic for that person, or just too time consuming for that person. But from the vendor perspective, my time is also valuable too. So let's try to define it as a starting point and put some type of value into it. And that's what we have to go through every time and start, by actually giving away the business impact analysis as a template. Because to some executive, they might not think that's any value. Hell, I can ask ChatGPT to come up with my business impact analysis plan, right? Yeah, rightfully so. So that is zero value. On the other hand, you pay tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands to consulting firm to conduct a business impact analysis because time is value. So I I'm hoping that our audience would able to read between or understand between what you and I talking about and able to pick up some insight from it and define it on their own to starting with based on their own position as a takeaway, right? Starting from their own single hat or dual hat, look at what is offering out in the internet by asking ChatGPT. And we have been saying that a lot of time, and we actually executing it. Open source is another free proposition out in on the market space. But how many people actually taking advantage of this open source? And I don't know. I don't have a statistics on it, but a lot of people come back to me and say, "Oh, open source is not safe." Well, we know that Microsoft just got hacked again. So you think Microsoft is safe? But where's the money goes into? Do I want to hire a person to learn all about the open source or executing everything on open source? No, that's not what we're saying. It has to be have a balanced approach. And to have this balanced approach, we believe, at least in my own, 2 cents worth. It's like, look, we got to look at what is my budget. I got to look at what is the value of that solution being provided to me. And is this something that worth for me to give up my, weekend to execute? If it's something that I can do over the weekend, why should I pay somebody to do it? And part of for, my interns and my mentees that have been working around me, I'd say, look, your job might get replaced because now AI can do it. So if you don't work harder at your school days, try to be more critical thinking about your career path. I'm sorry, unfortunately, that the technology is available to replace some of your job. And I just share that with Sean internally. Say, look, I can create a PowerPoint presentation in less than an hour based from the thought process to the point I generate a PowerPoint presentation. Back in those days, it might take a week or 2 weeks and have at least 1 or 2 people to help me to go into the content, evaluate the grammar, the English part of it. And that's where Sean comes in. And then before we hire a graphic designer or somebody as an intern to turn it into a PowerPoint presentation. Now, I'm not going to advertise who does it, but for $30 a month, that I can have it all done within an hour. So that is where we believe, or at least you and I talked about it from as a vendor perspective now, that we have to offer value to our customers and prospects. And it doesn't have to be start from a commercial value. Sometimes it's just conversation like this. It can provide value for some of the executive and the owner of that particular part to start the communication and start the journey going.
No, you're exactly right. And the generative AI, whichever platform folks prefer, it's a fine area to start. There's nothing wrong with that, to become comfortable with just what the expectations would be. But I would say right now, within the analysis and the conversations that are necessary to build a modest business impact analysis or a business continuity plan, the mitigation steps that are associated with those, and the communications associated with those, right? A lot of the time, it's the plan isn't what's the most important part, it's the planning. And so if the organization is delegating that, conversation to prompt engineering, that's exactly what you're going to get out of it. And having a person who understands business resilience and continuity and risk management, risk assessments to actually perform that tasking is where that value, as you mentioned, comes into play, because it's the interaction and the discussion that occurs between those silos that's actually more important than the document that comes out at the end, because you're building trust, you're addressing assumptions, and you're driving that rapport so that when something happens, I know Stanley has this area, I know Sean has that area, and we've already had the conversation about these gray areas, because no plan survives first contact. Sure, the first 3-4 steps should, but after that, it morphs, it changes. That's always the asterisk, right? You can't plan for everything, but we can lay out good principles and practices that can, work for 99% of any incident that occurs. And that's where response planning really comes into play, and using, our human brain. And we have to also consider the other part of it. I wrote on this a while ago now, but I think we lose sight also that we operate and we work in organizations. We don't work in mechanizations, today at least. We are organizations. We're organized organisms, subsystems working together for a greater good, for a larger organizational piece. right? When we start to distill and try to automate everything, that's when we turn into mechanizations, and that's where things break. And again, I know a lot of people watching this webinar live or on the recording. I'd love to talk to someone. Please reach out to me if you've never had an API fail. If you've never had a backup source, fail to run over the weekend. There are so many things that are automated or just, push the button and walk away, that as we lose sight of that, that's when the challenges really occur. And that's why we have to even include those things on risk registers, because even our redundancies and our mitigations can go wrong. So what do we do when they go wrong? How many people were impacted by AT&T recently?
Yep.
Right. And these are two things that, I'm looking at the conscious of time. So
Please.
now we got the starting of the journey, at least some idea starting of the journey. And for the audience, if they not clear, let me simplifying it is knowing the unknown. And then second is what just Frank talking about, the mechanism is the building blocks. What we keep talking about, the building blocks. It's like, you can't just build a castle overnight. It's a stone at a time. Then the third part is continuous measuring and monitoring. Now, two things that I want to bring up what Frank's brilliant idea when you talk about. One is risk optimization. And the other one is, now jump to the end of it, is crisis management. And how I look at, Frank, please share those two topics with our audience a little bit more. But of course, crisis management is what we're talking about. It's like buying insurance. It's like, okay, I know that, luckily that I haven't had an accident for a while, but hey, we still have to buy auto insurance, right? When the driving side of things. Why do I need it? As part of the crisis management, just put that into an analogies. Please, share your thoughts about the risk optimizations, because I think that's a brilliant idea. And then tied it into the crisis management of it, because everybody want to avoid those crises. I hope they want to avoid those crises.
I do, yes. So risk optimization, a lot of people talk about risk mitigation, but again, I think changing language to risk optimization goes to one of the earlier points that you made during this conversation, Stanley, and that's, where do we end? And so it's, if we want to mitigate every risk, every vulnerability that's out there, turn your systems off, shut down your servers, lock your doors, walk away. You have now mitigated risk. Close your business, you're done. Now, that's not why we're in business, right? Where risk optimization looks at that risk register, looks at those challenges, and starts to prioritize and looks at what's the return on investment, right? Speak the language of business when you're talking with business professionals. Change your language for the CHRO than you would for the CFO, than you would for the CIO, and you'll have a great conversation. So, optimize the risk for an intrusion. Well, to what system? To my most critical information? Do I want to put in that $100,000 system to safeguard my $200 million, source code? Seems like a really good return on investment to me. Do I want to, invest the $100,000 to protect the $150,000 asset? I don't know. Let's talk about it. What else is there? You said insurance. Okay. Insurance is a risk transference. Now, insurance. Again, how many people love to deal with their insurance company, either from a personal or a business perspective? Ooh, I love it. I apologize if there's any insurance folks on the call. But in all seriousness, insurance is there for our backup for a time of crisis, but it doesn't get you out of the crisis. There are limits. There are bounds for when they're qualified. Can you prove that you did everything you were supposed to according to your contract? And there's 10 different policies that I'm sure anyone on this call can probably start to call out. And do we really have a register of all those requirements on each and every one? So the insurance companies are going to require you to prove all of those conditions. So when I hear insurance I have insurance. I don't need to think about that business continuity or crisis management. The insurance agent will come in after your business has closed because they're not there on day 2, maybe even day 20. You have to survive the initial impact
That's right.
to then use that insurance. And so that's why, as we talk about and look at risk as a whole, cyber, physical, supply chain, third party, there's so many different aspects that need to be explored to have those critical conversations. If an investment in a program, in headcount, in time is really worth it. And there's always something that can be done, but when you optimize it, you have to know when good is good enough. And I know it hurts me to even say those words because I never want to see loss. It goes against the fundamental principles of what a lot of us do in the GRC space, in the cyber space, and physical space. But those are actually probably some of the best conversations that I've had with my leadership and with my clients, is to actually have them think about that acceptable loss and give examples, because that's when you're going to understand when is it enough? When can we say we can stop? But also, I think the other important side of that same coin, Stanley, is when do we not want to backslide to? So we've met our mark. That's great. But do we relax to a certain point that becomes untenable? And so having those conversations really helps organizations focus in on what's the next step.
And that's go back into the automations, right? Isn't that the automation can help to continue with the measure and monitoring process?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No. And that's why with a lot of systems, and I'll even, introduce Sarah to say that constant measuring and monitoring tells a story, right? It's not a snapshot in time. It's trending. It's what was it before? What was it 2 times before that? Tell the story,
It becomes that
right?
legally defensible evidence when the insurance claim has to happen.
Exactly. Exactly. So listen, what are we doing here today? We're educating and we're telling a story.
Right.
If we weren't going to tell a story, just put a slide or 2 up, maybe put a little background music on for some white space, and that's it. We're done. We're walking away. But to make decisions and help the organizations we work with, we have to tell a story.
One of the things back when I was leading a company, and I did trust NetSwitch to give me information and guidance when it came to IT.
Oh,
What
now
was
he say that.
lacking, yeah, now I say that. What in contrast though, what was lacking was the going back to the value, the cost justification, the ROI, the return on investment to safeguard against these cyber risks wasn't there relative to me having a conversation about the physical safety of the facility, of my distribution facility and the inventory in it and all the equipment. There's a valuation to that. I could see it, I could touch it. So much in cyber we can't see and touch. And Stanley and I were having this conversation recently is how do you justify the return on investment, the cost justification, as you were talking about before, that $50,000, is it worth it? And what that means. And Rohit mentioned here in the comment section is that he so often sees organizations being reactive as opposed to proactive. And Stanley and I talk about that with companies. There's a value to being proactive today and learn to be adaptive because of the dynamic nature of risks, regardless of what they are, physical and cyber. And the regulatory bodies are starting to put more of that on the cyber side, much like they have on the physical side over time for businesses. Protect your employees, protect against fire. All these things have been there from the regulatory side. Now it's coming on the cyber side. So Rohit, thanks for your comment. And this is why we do these things, to help educate people. But how would you go about justifying on a cyber side in regard to what you do for the resiliency and the business continuity?
I would recommend every organization to start with that risk assessment, because every organization has different programs running, different items that run their business that help them do their daily work. Maybe it's a ERP or a customer module, whatever it might be. There are
Stanley,
so
I
many.
would say the number of times we see shadow IT running in the background, nobody knows is running.
Well, hey, there's a lot of virtual servers out there on a desktop in a back room that probably has 2 inches of dust on it. It's understanding those, and that brings up a great point that I'll just go on a tangent. Very 30-second is to be proactive and to really dig into risk in a company. It requires trust.
Right.
It requires the good conversations to say, hey, you know what, Sean? There's this server in the back. It's a virtual network that we've had set up because we didn't have whatever 3 years ago. And we don't dare turn it off because that's what's running this platform today. Right? Not many people want to own up to that. But in today's environment, having that trust and candor with leadership, that the employee who's sharing it is going to trust that they're not going to be penalized for it because they want to see the success of this program working, is absolutely paramount. So that's where I would start, is building that trust and candor around the program and the benefits that it will have.
And there could be a justification, even in your view of working with customers in dealing with these risks, there could be a justification for retaining a legacy system for the
Absolutely.
machine that goes ping, and that's all it does. But
Right.
it's critical.
And again,
And
it's
sorry,
eyes wide open. It's eyes wide open. I understand what it is. And there's, again, we talked about insurance and risk transference, risk acceptance.
Yeah.
That's the risk optimization. That's how people can say, I understand, I accept that risk. I'm not going to invest to replace that today, but I know it's there. Let's talk about it during our next quarter review. Nothing wrong
Right.
with that at all.
Right.
And there was an interesting case that one of our previous customers came to us, a small company, small wealth management company, and it was one thing that basically the owner come and asked me to do is like, hey Stanley, I spend a lot of money relatively in his company into my IT team and my compliance to meet with FINRA, but I don't know what they're doing. How can you help? And is that is the in some level is that trust, but it's trust but verify, right? And verify in this case.
Yeah.
Is trust and verify. And it's like, that was it's like, okay, how much money are you going to charge me? And I said, well, this is what we're going to do. This is going to be XYZ dollar amount. And of course, the first conversation when we interviewed the IT team, it's like, okay, what do you think the percentage wise that is meeting to FINRA requirement? So of course, everything we do, it ties into a framework, compliance issue, or regulations. That's how we measure our success. So in that case, FINRA, oh, we about XYZ%, of course, about 50. That's how they rate themselves. But of course, they have no way to measuring it. By the time we engaged, did our security and risk assessment, and based on the result, it was about 26%. So there was a gap already. So this is the part that, okay, we didn't tell the owner right away, but we share the finding, tell the IT team, tell their consultant, hey, these are the things that we identify you need to fix. And forget about policies and procedure. We talk to the compliance consultant separately, and that's the part that they need to handle on their own. Then we go back into measuring again, after, and this is the time that we understand how efficient or effective their operation works. So we say, based on our own our experience, it's going to take about 60 days to address it. it took like 4 months and still not complete.
Hmm.
So at that point, we have to go back to the management and the owner and say, look, sorry, after, supposed to be a 2 months engagement, now into 4, but we still could not get everything that we need. Because we couldn't do a second test because these are the things that still as a gap, and that is basically find out the effectiveness of about that organizations. And of course, these are the things that unfortunately Sean was in that nasty call between the owner and how we translating the report into the rest of the stakeholders within that organization. So it wasn't a pleasant call, but it's a wake-up call the way we see it is, because it's better that the management demanding needs to be fixed whatever it takes, then they get hacked and the hackers asking them for ransomware. So that's the way we look at it. Yes, it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be pleasant from time to time. And it's a hard pill to swallow to take that step. But that's how we look at it from a preventive management rather than, of course, you got to know what the crisis would be so you can prevent it as well, too. So how can we look at it from a reverse engineering perspective, from a crisis management perspective, and associate them with the risk and identify those risks associated with the risk, and then put a plan together to take actions on them.
And Stanley, I'll just kind of follow up on that one comment and story. It's a great demonstration. But isn't that wonderful that the company discovered that before they had an actual incident? And that's where that proactiveness comes in. Nobody wants to have that report after an incident comes in. How could you let that happen? That's what the report will state. It will state all that. But by actually asking the question and finding out, that prevented a lot of headache and frankly, a lot of cost to the business and to the brand long term, certainly.
And I can put the statistics around it. About 30% of our customer asking us to do pen tests is because they got hacked.
Exactly.
I laugh
But
about it,
that's
but because they go back into your point, but at that point, it's like, well, you're asking for a pen test. Now you're asking for a pen test after they got hacked. Well, first of all, you got to look at, your business continuity plan, your data backup. Don't ask me to do a pen test now. How are you going to recover from it first? So that is the part of the crisis management, business continuity plan, and go back into the educational process that you're expert on.
and that's why it goes into that continuum, right? We want to have solid preventative, risk measured programs before there's an incident. Everyone wants to stay to the left of that incident chain, but as we discussed before, it will occur. So when it occurs, make sure that all of us have a crisis management plan to deal with the incident itself. And maybe even Sean, in the story that you shared, that's almost, life safety of things, going out of control, going kinetic and shutting down, but also, that there's a business continuity section of that plan as well, so that everyone is united in what needs to occur and the communications are flowing. The planning has been done, the teams are assembled, and people know how to recover effectively. And I don't have this statistic in front of me, excuse me, but those that have a business resilience program in place, I will look for it, but I think it's like 27% have an actual mature program, and they did not recover to the point of their impact. They actually recovered beyond their point of impact because they were able to move systems that were unmovable before. The companies and organizations that don't have a plan in place and rely on hope, the majority of them actually fail. And actually, for the SMBs that you talked about, Stanley, that's where the critical failure of the business occurs. It may take a year or two, but you can chart it back to that one critical incident, and then it's just a death by 1,000 cuts. And it's an unfortunate, preventable aspect for all business.
Wow. All right. Well, Stanley, I think we've reached our hour. And
Well,
so,
thank you, Frank. Thank you
Frank,
for the
I wanted to
audience.
thank you for joining us today. If you'd like to know more about Frank or connect with him, you can find him on LinkedIn as Frank Wood with Hawkeye Risk Advisors. If you want to know more about NetSwitch, you can check us out at netswitch.net or connect with me and Stanley on LinkedIn, both of us under the NetSwitch company profile. And if you're interested in learning more about cyber risk management and governance, join us and the other risk professionals that we have in the community on CyberRisk Governance in the LinkedIn groups. We look forward to you joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next live event that we have here. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks,
Thank you,
Frank.
everyone. Thank you, Stanley.
Bye-bye.